G'day there. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mick Barron. I'm one of the pastors from West Beach Community Church. And today we're actually kicking off a tiny little baby series from the book called Philemon. And when I say baby series, I mean baby series. It's a very small series that we're doing, as we're only going to go and spend 2 Sundays looking through the book of Philemon. Now, we're only going to do 2 Sundays because the book of Philemon is one of the shortest books in the entire Bible, and it's actually the shortest book written by the Apostle Paul. And if someone was to sum this book up in one word, a common word that a lot of people would come up who are familiar with this book and had read this book, a common word that someone would use to sum it up would be forgiveness. Now, even though the book doesn't actually contain the word forgiveness in it itself, the overarching theme is so strongly based on forgiveness. I think it would be actually rare that someone would finish reading this book and not have their mind and their heart immediately cast over to that relationship that they have in their life that so desperately needs restoration, attention, and forgiveness. So our series in Philemon, as I said, it's over 2 weeks, so we're going to break it up into 2 sections. Now, this week, the first section, we're going to look at the story of forgiveness, which is found in Philemon. And next week, next Sunday, we're going to ask the question, how do we encounter that forgiveness in our own story? So week 1 today, the story of forgiveness, and week 2, which is next Sunday, how do we encounter that forgiveness in our own story? So to get us moving, the first thing is, who was this Philemon guy? Who was he anyway? Well, Philemon was many things. He was a wealthy Roman Christian guy. He had a large home, we know, and he was the master of at least one slave, who we know was called Onesimus. Now, ownership of slaves back in biblical times, especially in the Roman Empire, was very common, and many scholars would even suggest it was up to 1/3 of the Roman Empire was made up of slaves. So the next big question is, who's Onesimus, right? We have some idea of who Philemon is, but who's his slave? Who's Onesimus? Well, unlike Philemon, Onesimus was not a Roman citizen. He was not wealthy. He was not a Christian, and he didn't own anything, as was the situation of the vast majority of slaves in biblical times anyway. And as a slave, we know Onesimus had a master, and of course that was Philemon. Philemon was Onesimus' master. Now, as one delves into this story, this short little story of Philemon, it seems that somewhere along the storyline, if you go and read this, you'll see this, that Onesimus has wronged Philemon. Whether he stole from him or whether he cheated from him, it's not actually clear. But he's wronged him, that's clear. So what happens is, after Onesimus wrongs Philemon, Onesimus flees Philemon's home and he runs away. He escapes because he knows he's in trouble. And he escapes to the city of Rome. And the city of Rome is where many escaped slaves would actually end up or flee to, because they were hoping to get lost in the crowds of the biggest city there in the empire. But what happens is, soon after Onesimus arrives in Rome, he meets someone. And that person he meets, the person he comes across, is a guy by the name of Paul. And we're talking about the Apostle Paul. And Paul was actually, at this moment when Onesimus turns up to Rome, he's actually being held in Rome as a prisoner. And what happens is they two spend time together. And through spending time together, and with Paul telling Onesimus about Jesus, Onesimus actually becomes a follower of Jesus right there in Rome. So you can imagine, Paul actually now finds himself in quite an interesting position, because you see, it was Paul as well, some years earlier, who had met Philemon, had spent a similar time with him, talking to him about Jesus, and he actually brought Philemon to Jesus as well. And now he'd done the exact same thing with Onesimus. And this is how the letter we know as Philemon was born. So what does Paul do now? Well, the first thing he does is he tells Onesimus that he must return to Philemon. There was a wrong that had been committed by Onesimus towards Philemon, And now, Paul would have told him, as a follower of Jesus, Onesimus had to face his wrongdoing. This could not go unresolved, and if you have read some of Paul's other letters, you will know that these things can definitely not go unresolved, especially amongst fellow believers. Paul writes often about this. The second thing Paul does is write a letter. So he's told Onesimus that he has to go back, but he doesn't send him back alone. He actually writes him a letter, and he sends this back with Onesimus. And this letter is directed to Philemon, and Onesimus is to give this letter back to him upon his return. Now, the fear that Onesimus must have experienced at this moment would have been intense. And why? Well, slaves were actually not considered people under the Roman law, but they were seen as mere objects, or they would have been seen as property of their masters. And as any other property can be, they could have been sold, they could have been exchanged for something else, but they also could have been beaten and killed if their masters so desired. There was one Roman writer, Juvenal, who actually wrote about this wealthy woman. He wrote about a story he knew of, and he wrote about this wealthy woman who ordered the crucifixion of one of her slaves. And when she was actually confronted about why she had done such a thing, about why she had crucified her slave, she refused to give any reason as to why she had done this, except that it was for her own pleasure. It's a bizarre story, but you can understand the fear that would have been driven into many of the slaves, and especially on Onesimus, as he was told he had to go back and face his master, knowing what fate could await him. But, excuse me, but Onesimus goes anyway, and whether this was because of his newfound deep trust in God, whether it was because of his obedience and his respect to Paul, or maybe it was because he had this knowledge of the good character of his former master in Philemon, and he hoped that the punishment wouldn't be extreme. We don't exactly know why he went back, but maybe it was a mixture of those three things. But in the end, Onesimus does. He goes back to Philemon. And imagine this, when he goes back, I don't know how he would have entered Philemon's home, whatever, but he goes back and he hands the letter to Philemon. And then he actually awaits his master's reply. Now, what did Philemon actually read when he opened that letter from Paul? What did Paul actually ask of Philemon? Well, Paul didn't just ask Philemon to let Onesimus off the hook. His letter didn't just say that. He didn't ask Philemon to let Onesimus become his slave again, without punishment though. He didn't ask just that. He didn't even ask him to forgive and to give Onesimus his freedom. He didn't ask him any of those things. What Paul did is he went beyond all of those things. And he actually asked Philemon the unthinkable. He asked Philemon to welcome Onesimus back. Remember, Onesimus was Philemon's slave. He was his property. And he was an individual who had wronged him. But Paul asked him to welcome him back, and to welcome him back, not as a slave, but as a brother. He asked him to welcome him back as an equal. Now remember again, upon Onesimus' return, Philemon had every right and would have been culturally expected to punish Onesimus greatly through whether it be a flogging, whether it be imprisonment, or even execution. But Paul writes to him, and he says to him in verse 17, so if you consider me a partner, this is Paul writing to Philemon, if you consider me a partner, a brother in Christ, a fellow worker of the gospel, if you consider me a partner, then welcome him, being Onesimus, welcome him just as you would welcome me. This is so much more than just forgiveness. Paul is asking Philemon not to just accept, but to embrace and to actually celebrate the return of Onesimus. And he says we're going to celebrate this not as a returned slave, but as someone who is a social equal, as a brother, as a long-lost member of the family. this request is well beyond kindness. This request, this story would have been unheard of in that time. This is a beautiful story of the unforgivable being not only forgiven, but welcomed and embraced. There are those out there's quite a few who would actually attack the Christian faith because nowhere in the New Testament is slavery directly denounced. Not even here in the letter to Philemon. And that seems to be a big problem, right? And the question is, why is that? Why is this so? When you look back at the Old Testament, the Old Testament actually condones slavery heavily. In the book of Exodus, it's written, it tells us about whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Slavery was punishable by death in the Old Testament. So why then? Why do the New Testament writings not blatantly declare that slavery is wrong also? It'd just make the whole situation a lot more easier, wouldn't it? Well, one writer wrote this concerning that question. This is what he wrote. It is significant that the New Testament nowhere attacks slavery directly. Had Jesus and the apostles done so, the result would have been chaos. Any slave uprising or rebellion would have been brutally crushed and slaves massacred. The gospel would have been swallowed up by the message of social reform. Christianity, however, sowed the seeds of the destruction of slavery. Slavery would not be destroyed by social upheaval, but by changed hearts. End quote. Paul does not order Philemon to free Onesimus. Neither does Paul directly teach that slavery is evil. But by ordering Philemon to treat Onesimus as a brother, Paul completely removes the abuses of slavery from the situation and their relationship. Paul calls Philemon to forgive, not with an argument of anyone deserving forgiveness, but by reminding Philemon of who Philemon, Paul, and Onesimus belong to, who they belong to, and therefore how are they to behave. Human beings reflect God more than ever when they forgive. But how do we do that? How do we actually forgive from the depths of our hearts? How do we forgive with changed hearts? How do we forgive what we perceive as the unforgivable? How do we let go of those deep, dark, and painful hurts or painful wrongdoings? How do we actually tear our foot? It feels sometimes like our foot is stuck in this trap. And how do we actually tear our foot from that holds us back from stepping into what the future and what God could possibly have for us tomorrow or around the corner? They're big questions, right? And we'll take a look at them next week as we ask the question, how do we encounter that kind of forgiveness in our own lives? Until then, take care of yourself, take care of each other. Vaya con Dios.